All right, let's get started here. All right, I want to welcome everyone. Sorry for the delay. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this class on Noahide laws. And we're speaking about marriage laws. Right, marriage laws for Noahide, whether they're allowed to marry, not allowed to marry. Right now, see, this was the best class of all because this is going to be the more controversial. Right, we're going to try and not get Ray thrown out all over the internet over here because we're going to try and keep this clean, so to speak. So we're going to speak about conception and contraception. This is a question comes up a lot. Actually, I think I've done Tanakh Talk, did an issue on, I did a whole video on this as well. Right, and we spoke before about the Noahide life cycle. Now we're going to speak about starting a family. So a lot of questions that come up about conception, how many kids, do I have to have, what about contraception? A lot of issues over here. So first of all, there's an obligation for Noahides to have kids. Right? Adam and Noah were commanded, be fruitful and multiply. But guess what? That command was not re-given at Mount Sinai. So what do we say before? We said before any mitzvah given before Sinai, that is not repeated. Who does it apply to? Jews. Right? So 159a. Jews it only applies to. Therefore, pru or vu to be fruitful and multiply is not a Noahide mitzvah. Right? It doesn't apply to them. But we did say there's an obligation of what we call Yishuv HaAretz, settling, civilizing the world, right? You don't have kids, well, that's going to be a disaster. Certainly for next generation. We won't have a next generation, right? It'd be an absolute disaster. So the commandment includes the expectation of reproduction, right? That people should have kids. Even, question is how many kids they have to have, right? Build a family, right? Family's been under attack, over the last number of years. Unbelievably under attack over here. Now, the question is going to be, okay, if there's no mitzvah pru or vu, right, of being fruitful and multiply, what about having children? What about the obligation of Yishuv HaAretz, settling, civilizing the world? What's the difference? If they're the same, then I don't need both. Right? The Torah never minces any words. Not going to say the same thing twice unless I have something else to learn. So it's a big difference. First difference is, what's Yishuv HaAretz? That's a general obligation. General obligation to reproduce, have children, right? And build build society, essentially. That'll apply to men and women. Now, obviously, men can't do without women, right? So, but for a woman, we'll see by pru or vu, let's say better. Pru or vu means be fruitful and multiply. Now, that only applies to Jewish men. Women, what's the reason? That's sort of an interesting explanation. What's the reason? It's been a long day here, right? What's the reason women are not obligated to having children? Now, obviously, you can't have children without women. Impossible, right? Impossibility. Even though I remember, her rabbi once giving a talk, about womenism and feminism and all that. So he asked them, big time feminists there, and he asked them, is there any difference between men and women? Any difference? They all say, no. He goes, okay, let's think again. Any difference? Anything you can think of. There's a difference between men and women. Oh, women can have children. Right? They don't necessarily need a husband. Do it in vitro. I know someone I grew up with. My parents' synagogue. Didn't get married. Probably never get married. Right? I don't know. Whatever the case is. Had a child. Had a child in vitro. Okay? But what's the reason women don't have the obligation? What's the reason? You can't do it without women. True. Biology 101, 101A. Right? But what's the reason? Very simple. A woman gives birth, it's considered a danger. Right? A definite danger. Even today, in civilized society, it's very rare. A woman, God forbid, dies in childbirth. Very rare. right? It used to be a lot more, more common. So there cannot be a command, on a woman to have children when it puts her life in danger. So so to have children, right? Everyone would agree that applies both to men and women. But to say there's an obligation to have children, be fruitful, multiply, it's only by men. It's only by Jewish men. Because God's not going to command a woman to put herself in danger. So you fulfill this commandment by having at least one boy, one girl. Also creates a number of de facto negative commandments as well. Right? For example, contraception. Right? It's going to be a major thing over here. Right? That is prohibited until you fulfill this mitzvah. Now again, there could be a number of number of allowances for contraception. Again, depending on the circumstances. So a person has to go to a proper rabbinic authority, to determine, but it can't be a flippant thing. Right? People think, yeah, what's the problem? I want to have kids, I want to have kids later. Who says you're allowed to put it off? Right? You have to have good enough reason. You can't just say, well, it's inconvenient. Well, too bad. Not a question about being convenient or not. So, person has to ask, a great halachic authority what to do. When you're allowed to, what the case is. So now, there's a question that's going to cause problems, and that is by contraception. Right? So we're gonna go step by step here. First thing is what we call coitus interruptus. What is coitus interruptus? Latin, haven't brushed up my Latin too much, right? Coitus interruptus seems to be prohibited. Why? Well, I mean spilling seed, essentially, right? Because that's what brought about the flood, right? Rashi says, Tanita 13a, Sanhedrin 108b, all flesh corrupted its way upon the earth, meaning to onanism. What's onanism? Spilling seed, right? Spilling seed over here. So furthermore, as we see, Er and Onan, sons of Yehuda, specifically punished for doing this, as says Genesis 38, verse 9, and Yevamos tractate, Yevamos 34b, discusses also, and they weren't Jews. Nobody disagrees over here, right? No one makes a claim Er and Onan are Jews. So that would be the simple proof. That would be the simple proof over here that spilling seed forbidden for a non-Jew. However, right, there's always a but, right? However, things are not always clear as they look. Before Mount Sinai, Noah is obligated over here. Obligated to be fruitful and multiply. After Sinai, no command. Right, so seemingly they're not, as it says in Sanhedrin 59a. Now, we have to ask the following question. So what happened by Er and Onan over here in the generation of the flood? Is that separate prohibition? Is that a whole separate issue of spilling seeds? Or do they not want to be fruitful and multiply? Now remember, there's Levirate marriage by Jews, meaning if the husband dies, if the husband dies over here and doesn't have children, so you have to marry, so the wife has to marry a brother. If he's got a brother, he's got to marry a brother, and if she conceives, has a boy, name it after him, after the one that died. Right? So what happened over here? What happened over here? Onan died, or forget who died first. Er died first, or Onan died first, whatever it is, and then comes along Er, or vice versa. And what happens? What happened? Rashi says that he spilled seed. He didn't want her to get pregnant because he knew child wouldn't be his. Be named after his brother. Right? So that's spilling seed. So the question is that independent transgression? Or because they didn't fulfill the obligation, be fruitful and multiply. So if they're punished for spilling seeds, then all Noahides are in trouble. Then it would apply to them. If it's due to be fruitful and multiply, not relevant. Right? That doesn't apply to Noahides over here. Also, there's going to be a whole question about masturbation, right? Male masturbation. So, if the prohibition is only, being fruitful and multiply, then again, if that doesn't apply to non-Jews, masturbation may be okay. Or maybe I'll tell you, it's an independent prohibition, spilling seeds, then it would be specifically prohibited. Comes along Tosfos, one of the great commentaries on the Talmud, is in Eder 59b. Takes the latter approach. What's that? Air owning generation of the floods. What didn't they do? They weren't fruitful, multiplying. They didn't want to have children. So that doesn't apply to Noahides today. So there's no reason why the act of air owning should be prohibited. So Tosfos would say, independent prohibition. The prohibition is from what? Be fruitful, multiply. That's the prohibition. 100% that's the prohibition. So therefore, according to Tosfos, what would we say? Masturbation's okay, right? For Noahide to be okay, it wouldn't be a problem. Comes along the Ramban. This commentary, the Talmud says, spilling seeds also a prohibition. Independent of being fruitful, multiply. Sorry, that's going to be forbidden. Come along all the other major early commentators, the Rashba, the Ram, the Ritva, they agree with the Ramban. That's going to be a prohibition. So that means two things over here. First thing is, according to Interruptus, prohibited form of contraception. Right? In other words, whatever person finishes not inside the woman. So that would be forbidden. Male masturbation, prohibited. That's what it would come out. That's how it should come out over here. Now the question is, if that's true, a person wants to use contraception, any form of contraception should be forbidden. Right? Certainly the use of condoms. Why? Right? Similarly, someone who's infertile. Similarly, that would also be a problem. Right? If a woman can't have kids, she's infertile. She can't have kids. So a person has relations, they're married, that's a problem. Similarly, should be a problem. Why isn't that wasting seed? She can't have kids. Or you could tell me, what if she's pregnant? How can you have relations when she's pregnant? She's also not going to have kids. Not going to get pregnant again. Right? Not going to get pregnant over here again. So whatever. We'll see about that. So here, there's a question what the Ramban actually means. Some say it's a biblical prohibition. Right? Certainly for a non-Jew. Masturbation means biblical prohibition. Some say it's a rabbinic prohibition. Others bring strong proofs that say it's really a biblical prohibition, Torah prohibition. And any time, and then what's the proof? Because any time something says, the Torah says that it's wicked in God's eyes, biblical prohibition, normally. Biblical prohibition upon everybody. So it would seem from here, and we'll have to see, we'll go further here, but it would seem there's a difference of opinion, but it would seem the majority opinion is forbidden. Right? Definitely be forbidden, whether Torah prohibition or rabbinic prohibition. Or you can say that's not a good thing to do anyway. Just weakens the body. A person, feels they need whatever, but maybe we'd say it's a moral imperative, right? But we're going to say over here it's either Torah prohibition or rabbinical. But let's say maybe it's not. Let's say it's not either. We'll just throw this out there. So what about a moral prohibition? Someone say they like to do it. What's the problem? Right, what's the problem? So don't we understand? Don't we really understand that that's creating life? See, you're wasting the potential to create life. Person had a hard day. They had this, they had that. They're not married. Whatever the case is, that's a problem. Right? That would be a definite issue. Even as a moral issue. We say it's a moral imperative. Right? But people today will say, come on, people do what they want. They do what they want. They come, they go, this, that. So if they want to do what they want, fine, but we don't care about that. Question is it forbidden Torah level or rabbinic level? And the question is going to be, is it a moral issue? So part of the marital bonds, even a prerequisite, is sexual intimacy, right, between a man and a woman. That there's no question. And we're going to now Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Shall cling to his wife, i.e. not to another man, right? We see homosexuality as a separate prohibition, Leviticus chapter 18. Nonetheless, the word for clinging in Hebrew connotes what? Sexual, right? It means sexual over here is other forms of intimacy. So therefore, if it's only supposed to be for your wife, then a person should not violate this prohibition, right, of spilling seed, right? So the problem, so one thing is over here, we're talking about intimacy, right? Certainly, special part of a marriage, not the only part, right? Some people may think it's the only, but it's not, right? Because if it's only about that, then you're going to lose interest pretty quick if you have nothing else, to talk about or whatever. It's also emotional, spiritual, intellectual, right? Intimacy as well, right? No question, right? No question about it. Now, that act itself, what's it for? Procreation, 100%. But also, it establishes a bond, very strong bond, between man and a woman, right? We don't look at it like the Christians, it's sinful, it's taboo, it's utilitarian, right? It can be harnessed, it can be used in the right way, right? We hold that even a woman's permissible to her husband doesn't mean he can be with her, every second of every day. He has to show a little bit of, he's got to wait. Can't treat his wife like an object, so to speak. So that means just because it's permissible, does not mean I'm allowed to indulge whenever I want. So the rabbinical authorities say that universal expelling seed during intercourse is part of the act. What happens? This is biology, 101, 101A, right? That is part of the act of intimacy between a man and a woman. Therefore, even a woman may be infertile, no issue over here. Is there no issue? Why is there no issue? Because that's part of the act. However, as we see from the example of Aaron Onan, the semen, even if you're on a twitch, you can't get pregnant. You're going to say, maybe it's wasting seed. But if it's a normal way of relations, not a problem. As long as it's not expelled outside the woman's body. That's a problem. That's a problem. You'll say, but you won't get pregnant either way. It doesn't matter. Right? We don't care about that. We care about that the final, the end of the act is done, so to speak. And even if she's not going to get pregnant, let's say she's pregnant already. She can't get pregnant again. Isn't that spilling seed? That would be spilling seed. Right? But if that's the normal way of intercourse, not a problem. That wouldn't be a problem. Now we're going to go through different things here. Condoms. What's the problem with condom? Problem is that the seed is collected within it and discarded. Doesn't go in the woman. Right? Even a little bit goes in. It's not going to get her pregnant. But it doesn't go in. Should not go in. So this should be a problem. This should be forbidden. This should be forbidden for spilling seed. However, not so simple. Why not? Because since we said spilling seed is permitted as part of the intimacy, so it could be. Maybe we'll say use of a condom is okay. Because what did we say before? What would be the obvious question? Obvious question is outside the woman's body. If it's outside the woman's body, no problem. Right? Why would that be a problem? It's inside the woman. But it's not going to the place it needs to go. That's the problem. That's the problem over here. So the rabbinic authorities compare condoms to IUDs. Right? IUDs are okay. Right? They're going to be okay over here. Why? Because here, what's the difference? Both devices are going to block semen from reaching the uterus, right? Biology 101, seed goes into the uterus, could get a woman pregnant, okay? So it's going to block the semen from going in, and that's all agree that semen that later exits a woman's body, no issue for us, right? No issue for men over here. What's he liable for? Semen actually expelled outside the woman's body. That's the problem. Right? That is the problem here. So now, what's the question? Question comes down whether or not the imposition of a condom between a man and a woman makes it the semen is outside the woman's body or not. That's the question. Right? And that's not really part of the marital act. Why not? Because the whole point is it's supposed to go in. if it doesn't go in or something's stopping it, that means it's not going in over here. Right, 100%. That's not going in over here. Even though the Sefer Sheva Mitzvahs Hashem, i.e. the divine code, permits the use of condoms, not so clear. Right, definitely not so clear. So that's interesting. Rav Chaim Coffman, blessed memory, said possibly use of condoms permitted, that there wouldn't be any liability, there wouldn't be any punishment. Right? He didn't say it was a psak. He didn't say it was like something conclusive, but he said could be. Could be, it might be okay. And Rav Osner, blessed memory, they have not seen any strong proofs to decisively permit or prohibit. In other words, not clear. Not clear over here. Definitely not clear according to modern rabbinic authorities. Now, the thing is, an IUD, it blocks it from going up to the uterus. Now, even though it blocks it, so what? It's a natural act. Semen goes in, so that's not a problem. Right? It goes to the right place, it just gets blocked. So that is definitely permissible because it's inside the body. It's not outside the body. It's getting blocked, doesn't matter. Right here, it's not even going in, that's the problem. Right? But again, it's not so clear. Not so clear over here. Sanhedrin 56a, the Tanaim dispute whether or not sterilization. What about sterilization? Is that an independent biblical prohibition for Noahide? So Rabbi Chizkiah in the school of Menashe hold Torah prohibition. Where do they know it out from? Because we got a verse, Genesis chapter 9, verse 7. It says, things that swarm on the earth multiply upon it. Others say no. Statement of blessing, not a command. It's come along the early commentators, later commentaries. Question is, what do we hold practically? So there's an independent prohibition of sterilization. The Gemara rules that a Jew may not have a Noahide castrate the Jew's animal. Right, it's Bab Messiah 9dp. What's the reason? Because it's a prohibition for a non-Jew to castrate. Not allowed to. Right, not allowed to castrate an animal. Now, if a Jew asks the Noahide to carry out such an act, Torah prohibition, putting a stumbling block. Right, it's putting a stumbling block, someone who's blind. Right, before the blind over here. Now, seemingly, there's no forbiddenness over here, no prohibition against sterilization. Later, rabbinic authorities, though, reject this line of reasoning, saying a Jew is also prohibited from asking a Noahide to do anything he himself a Jew can't do. Right? So it'd be forbidden for a Jew. How can you have a non-Jew do it? How can you have a Noahide do it? If he can't do it, a Noahide can't do it. Right? Because Jews are biblically prohibited from sterilization. So if they're prohibited, they can't do it. And they can't ask somebody, a Noahide, to do it. However, no implication Noahides are prohibited from castrating animals. Right? That the Rambam brings, and other commentaries, and if a person needs to castrate an animal, then we hold it's definitely better. He's not allowed to do it himself. He's not allowed to have another Jew do it. He's allowed to have a Noahide do it. But again, there's a lot of debate. A lot of debate over here. So, the large majority of rabbinic authorities are going to permit sterilization in Noahides. There are a number of reasons. But it's very hard to find anybody who's going to say that's a problem. Right? Majority are going to say it's fine because, again, there's no obligation over here. There's no obligation of being fruitful multiply. Might be a different issue, to inhabit the earth, and have children in general. It doesn't sound from the vast majority of biblical authorities that should be forbidden. Sterilization should be okay. Now, there's another issue. There's another issue over here. And what's that? You're not allowed to cause any destruction or permanent damage to your body. Right? That is brought down, that sterilization might be a different issue. Right? It's going to cause harm. to the body. It's going to be a benefit, but it's going to cause harm over here. This includes many surgeries not deemed medically necessary. Cosmetic surgery, right? Maybe an exception to the rule. We'll see. But let's say it's not necessary. It's not a necessary thing. So who says you're allowed to do it? Who says you're allowed to do it if you don't have a compelling medical reason, right? So in this case, same thing. If you don't have a compelling medical reason, surgical sterilization should not be used for contraception because you're causing damage to the body. Right? Even a non-Jew, not allowed to cause damage to the body. Last thing here is, and that is pharmaceutical contraceptives. Let's say like the pill. Permanent physical damage, that's permitted. Right? That would definitely be permitted under certain circumstances. And the contraceptive film or foam, right, should also be okay, even though foams can cause urinary tract infections. The pill can cause other side effects, right? That would cause other side effects, spotting, other things. That would be more of a problem for Jews than for non-Jews, right? But again, it doesn't stop anything. Just means the egg doesn't come down, right? So there's no way to get the woman pregnant, right? The pill's like 99.9%. So IUDs, I have heard people, have gotten pregnant on it. Some people also use a sponge or what's it called, diaphragm, right? Diaphragm also, works like an IUD, except that, just put it in and out, and it stops the flow, so to speak, but that would be okay. So because semen's going in, same thing by the pill. Pill doesn't stop anything, right? It just doesn't allow the woman to get pregnant, so that should be okay, right? So, the alternative to a pill, which has, can't have negative side effects, that the contraceptive film has almost no side effects. That's probably the best. It's probably the best thing, right? Or foam, again, foam can cause, we just said urinary tract infections. But, IUDs, they can be in for years. You don't necessarily have a problem. It's putting it in that could render a woman, to be forbidden to her husband. There could be issues, could be some issues, maybe some spotting issues here and there, but in general, I think that's better in certain ways than the pill. The pill just has a lot of, negative side effects, for some women, or maybe for a lot of women. But in any case, contraceptive film is okay, foam is okay, the pill is okay, right? Because that's not stopping the flow. Anything that's going to stop the flow and the semen does not go in, that's a problem. 100% that's a problem. That's the issue over here, right? So that's the idea of conception and contraception, for a non-Jew. And again, these things, the problem is that people think, now for Noahides might be different, right? But we take this pretty darn seriously. It's not, here in Israel, I can tell you, there are very few rabbinic authorities willing to give permissibility for women, to have a break, let's say. It depends. If a woman has, let's say, 4 kids under the age of 6, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard. So there are rabbinical authorities that will give permissibility, right? They will give permissibility because, the woman will say, if I get pregnant again, within the next year, I'm going to go nuts because, my oldest one is 5 or 6 and it's, it's hard. It's definitely hard. So, having so many kids is definitely a blessing, but at the same time, if it's going to cause real damage to the woman, again, they have to go to a proper rabbinic authority. And this person has to hear both sides. He has to hear the sides, whatever, and, they'll decide, right? But it's, I can't say what goes on in the States. I don't know. I can tell you here, it's not so easy. People know which rabbanim to go to get permissibility, if they can't handle it. They know, there's certain people, that will give, permissibility. Some will give maybe a year, revisit it in a year. Some will give 6 months, etc. But again, these are severe things. These aren't just flippant things. Okay, I don't want to get pregnant. I have permissibility. That's it. I can do what I want. It's not true, right? These are severe prohibitions. Severe prohibitions over here. Now, again, psychologically, it's a huge thing here. And if a woman feels she's going to go to pieces, and it definitely seems like she's going to go to pieces if she gets pregnant, within 6 months, whatever, that is a very serious thing to take into consideration. That's not just something, well, you can hack it, be tough, suck it up, as Whoopi Goldberg would say. No, they're not machines. A lot of women that, certainly beginning of marriages are, they're working at the same time, helping support their husbands, so they can learn, and people do it for a long time. Depends, how long they can keep doing it. But, women aren't machines. They do a lot. They do a lot over here. So, try and expect they're going to have, 5 kids in 6 years or, whatever the case is. And they, they want to break for a certain amount of time. It makes sense, but you have to see what the dynamics are. Some people will say, I need a break because we don't have money. Another kid costs money, right? So, money's always a trial. It's always a trial. Person can have 2 kids and have difficulty. 2 kids, 6 kids, it doesn't matter. But each kid brings its own blessing. That's why people have difficulty. Someone once told me, he said, the marriage document, read the fine print, and said you can only have 3 kids. I said, really? I can't read the fine print. I don't buy Fogels. It doesn't say that in my document. Right? So, so in the secular world, they'll think you're nuts. I had somebody tell me once, right? Kind of crazy, think about it. They're into animals. He's a veterinarian, whatever. And he's like, I like animals more than kids. I had 1. You're nuts for having 7. That's what he said. I like animals better than kids. Okay? He's got 1. Okay? But, people make their own choices. People make their own choices. But, each kid we believe is a mitzvah over here. So if it's a mitzvah, what are you doing? Stopping it. What are you doing? Not allowing it. Again, if a woman is going to go to pieces and she's not going to function, it's like, listen, we got to go, we got to go to the Rav, we got to go ask him, etc. Because I'm just going to go to pieces. 5 kids under the age of 6 or 4 kids under the age of 6, not an easy thing. Definitely not an easy thing, right? But it's not so simple either. Because so here you're talking about an opportunity you could have kids and you're not having them, right? So that comes into play. Okay, even if it's permissible, certain types of contraception, you're doing something that really shouldn't be done, right? So again, here in Israel, they're much stricter than probably other places, right? But again, it depends on the circumstance. I don't want to say in general, but it's a major factor is not going to be money over here. They're not going to listen to that. The major factor is going to be, the woman just says, I'm going to collapse. Right? I'm going to collapse over here. Right? So that goes a long way. But again, each case is its own separate case. And, it's not a blanket, permissibility, so to speak. You say, woman's going to have trouble, let me, give me permissibility. It's not so simple. The Rav there is going to ask a lot of questions. A lot of questions about a lot of different things. And then I'll make a decision. So that is a story with reproduction and settling, civilizing the world, and conception and contraception, which is permissible, which isn't, etc. So any questions on any of that? Or anybody have any general questions? All right. Adrian, you got an email? Fine. You can definitely email it. Otherwise, okay, if there are no questions, I guess then I'll sign up. Hopefully next week it'll be easier to get in. So we definitely will have class next week. The week after is going to be Rosh Hashanah. So we won't have class after that. But week after that will be right before Yom Kippur. That shouldn't be a problem. And then we'll be off till after Sukkot. So we'll give you all the dates and all that. So I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day. Almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.